AP 120, Chapter 9, topic Cerebrum and Ventricles. So the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, and it has two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, which with visual looking at it look pretty similar. And within the cerebrum is where we have the sensory information being interpreted, where we have motor functions, motor commands being sent out, and all of the higher mental functions, what we think of as thinking, personality, creativity, that sort of thing. The folds sticking up in the cerebrum are called one gyrus or many gyri. The crevices going down are referred to as one sulcus or many sulci. So the gyri are the mountains and the sulci are the valleys. Separating the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum is a space referred to as the longitudinal fissure. When we look at this view of the brain, this mid-sagittal section, this whitish structure here, this strip of whitish tissue, that is the corpus callosum and is considered part of the cerebrum because it connects the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere to each other. Again, here is a section that shows the gray matter that is more superficial. That gray matter is referred to as the cerebral cortex. And it is, again, mostly neural cell bodies and lots of synapses that are occurring there, causing the ability for the brain to do many of its functions. All right, you can break up a cerebral hemisphere into 5 lobes. 4 of these lobes you can find on the surface. One of them is deeper. So you have the frontal lobe, anterior under the frontal bone. This is where the higher reasoning and thinking, personality sort of things are localized. Then we have the parietal lobe, somewhat underneath the parietal bone. Then we have the occipital lobe toward the back or posterior near the occipital bone. Laterally, we have the temporal lobe near the temporal bone. And then if we go into this lateral sulcus and cut away some tissue, we can find the insula. So the 5th lobe is the insula. So we can look at the brain based on where functions are localized. And we can break it up into motor function, sensory function, and associated areas. A few landmarks to help us out here. The lateral sulcus is this long fold separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And then the central sulcus on the top separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So cutaneous sensations coming from all over the body, especially sensations having to do with the skin, arrive and localize to this strip of material in the parietal lobe. And this is often called the primary somatosensory area. So if you get touched on your finger, somewhere will light up on this strip of brain tissue, part of the parietal lobe. Now, if you look at that strip of tissue, you can see the body mapped out on it. The tongue, face, hand, body, feet. And this is called the somatosensory map or homunculus. And basically, different regions of the body have larger portions of the brain tissue devoted to them, dependent on how many sensory neurons are localized to that area. So our face, our hands, very sensitive, experiencing lots of sensations. Say our elbow, not so much, so it doesn't take up that much space. And so this all is receiving information related to touch, proprioception, pain, itch, tickle, thermal, whether you're touching something warm or cold, all localizing, arriving to the primary somatosensory area. All right, there are other locations in the brain for the other senses. So the insula is where you find the taste area. So taste gustation is localized to the insula. The auditory area is localized to the temporal lobe. And olfaction, smell, is also localized to the temporal lobe, so both hearing and smell. The visual area is localized to the occipital lobe. A little strange, your eyes are in the front, but they send their signal to the back of the brain. Associated areas, association sensory areas, are areas near where the sensory information arrives in the cerebrum, and it helps to analyze, interpret that sensory information. So for instance, near the visual area in the occipital lobe, we have association areas combining the information so that you can do things such as recognize the objects you see. In the temporal lobe, we have areas near the auditory area that allow us to interpret the auditory patterns to help us recognize what those sounds are. Within the frontal lobe, we have areas that are focused on concentration, planning, problem solving, very important for higher reasoning. And then we also have this region called the sensory speech area. And this area, somewhat near the auditory area, is what allows us to actually understand individual words and know what those words mean. All right, for motor areas, we have this strip of tissue that's part of the frontal lobe, so the posterior part of the frontal lobe, right next to that central sulcus. And this is called the primary motor area. So almost all of the commands for voluntary muscle movement, so for controlling our skeletal muscles, originate in the primary motor area and then get sent out to those muscles. The primary motor area also has its own homunculus, as it were, so a map of the body. And in this case, a region gets more brain tissue dependent on how many muscles are localized there. So we have a ton of tiny muscles in the face and head, in the hand, in the tongue, so they get a large portion of the primary motor area. The arm, sure, has very large muscles, but there's not as many of them, so it doesn't need as much brain tissue. All right, so some associated motor areas. We have the frontal eye field, sort of near the primary motor area. This allows us to help control the eye movements. We have an area that's the motor speech area. This is the portion of the brain that allows us to use our muscles to form actual words so that we can actually make the sounds that are words. All right, here is again another view of the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. While they are very similar, they do have some differences. For instance, the right hemisphere is receiving signals and controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere receives signals from and controls the right side of the body. So right side of the brain, left side of the body, left side of the brain, right side of the body. Pretty unexpected. It turns out that within the brainstem, as tracks carry information up to or from descending from the brain, they cross over. So there's actually an area in the brainstem where ascending and descending tracks cross over, switching sides. Why do we do this? I don't think anyone knows. And it's worth pointing out again that we do have the corpus callosum that connects the right and left hemispheres so that they can communicate with each other. All right, when we look in the coronal section of the cerebrum, we see that there is some dark tissue deeper in the brain. These regions of darker tissue are called the basal nuclei. So they're deep masses of gray matter, and they have important functions. For instance, they help in relaying impulses, motor impulses from the cerebrum. So they're involved in helping to regulate and control motor activities. So a nucleus, what is that? Hopefully you remembered it's a collection of neural cell bodies. So high concentration of neural cell bodies, meaning lots of synapsing, lots of processing occurring there. So we know that the basal nuclei can interact with the motor cortex and information to it. Also can interact with the thalamus and the cerebellum. So it is deeply involved in helping to coordinate and control our movements. We've learned a lot about basal nuclei from, unfortunately, the side effects of Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. These diseases actually damage the basal nuclei over time, and we're able to see things like the fact that people with Parkinson's start to have an uncontrolled shake in their muscles. So they start to lose the ability to smoothly control their muscles. All right, moving on to the ventricles. The ventricles are spaces, fluid-filled spaces found within the brain. And the fluid is, of course, cerebral spinal fluid. So in each hemisphere of the cerebrum, we have the lateral ventricles, so right and left lateral ventricles filled with cerebral spinal fluid. They then connect to the third ventricle that lies between the two sides of the diencephalon, and then the cerebral aqueduct connects to the fourth ventricle, which is between the brainstem and the cerebellum, and then these connect to the central canal in the spinal cord and to the subarachnoid space in the brain. Now, the cerebral spinal fluid is produced by structures called choroid plexuses, which are blood capillaries lined with a particular neuroglial cell, and that neuroglial cell is the epidermal cells. So epidermal cells pull fluid out of the bloodstream to create the cerebral spinal fluid that then flows through the lateral ventricles to the third, to the fourth, and then around the brain and spinal cord. And again, it's worth pointing that all of these structures are continuous with each other and continuous with these subarachnoid spaces, and has sort of a flow or current to move the materials around the spinal cord and brain. Now, the ventricles are where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced. It turns out within the skull, there are specialized areas where the cerebral spinal fluid returns to the bloodstream. But before that happens, the cerebral spinal fluid ends up providing some important functions. It helps to physically support the brain and spinal cord, helps to hold them up, buoy them in place, so they don't press down on the hard bones of the skull and vertebral canal. Cerebral spinal fluid helps to absorb or provide cushion to the brain and spinal cord so you could get hit in the head and the brain doesn't bang into the skull. Instead, just buffers and moves a little bit within the cushioned effect of the cerebral spinal fluid. And also there are many ions within the cerebral spinal fluid that can be used by the nervous tissue. And that is it for this part of the lecture.